Two people, both silent, both absent from each other's daily life in the specific, private way that no contact produces. Not the ordinary distance of people who were never close, but the charged, weighted silence of people who were genuinely close and are now genuinely not speaking. From the outside, it looks symmetrical. From the inside, it is two entirely different experiences happening in parallel, shaped by entirely different attachment architectures, producing entirely different interior weather. Inside the avoidant silence. The avoidant silence begins as confirmation. The system asked for space. The system got space. The alarm that had been running in response to the empath's genuine presence, the specific, low-level, always-present cost of being close to someone who was real to them, has quieted. The pressure has lifted. The walls are back up, and the interior is private again. Relief arrives. It was always going to arrive. This is not fabricated or performed. The relief is genuine, and it functions, as it always has, as the system's evidence that the distance was right, that the self-sufficiency is real, that the managed, self-contained life is the correct configuration. For a while, this holds. And then something else begins to arrive alongside the relief. Not instead of it. Both things are present simultaneously, which is part of what makes this specific silence different from others the avoidant has created. The empath is not waiting. This is the specific thing the avoidance system registers before the conscious mind has language for it. The quality of the empath's absence is different from the absence of people who have been previously managed to a safe distance. Those absences had a quality. The quality of someone who was not contacting, but was still oriented, still available at the periphery, still, in some fundamental way, pointed toward the avoidant even in their silence. The empath silence does not have that quality. The empath is genuinely elsewhere. And the relief, which was supposed to be simple, develops a complication that the system has no established protocol for. Inside the empath silence. The empath silence did not arrive from strategy, did not arrive from psychological insight about what silence produces in avoidance, did not arrive from a decision made in clarity. It arrived from the honest limit of a finite resource that had been drawn on past the point of sustainable replenishment. The empath gave, genuinely, specifically, at real cost, into a dynamic that received the giving without returning it in proportion, gave the specific, costly quality of genuine empathic attention, the accurate seeing, the warmth without demand, the patience that came from real understanding rather than from the performance of tolerance. And the giving finally ran out. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of decision, in the quiet, accumulating, one day at a time way that reserves deplete when they are not being refilled. The silence is what honest depletion looks like from the outside. From the inside, it feels, initially, like disorientation. The dynamic, however painful, however costly, was organizing, required constant attention, constant calibration, constant investment of the empath's most significant capacities. And organizing things, when they are removed, leave a specific quality of emptiness that is distinct from grief. The empath in the early silence does not know quite what to do with themselves. Not because they lack a self, because the habit of orientation toward the avoidant was so thoroughly established that the reorientation toward their own life requires something that does not happen automatically. Deliberate return. Patient, honest, unglamorous return to the question of who they actually are, when they are not primarily defined by their relationship to someone else's defended interior. The two processes running in parallel. Both people are silent. Neither is contacting the other. From the outside, the situation appears static. Inside, two separate processes are running simultaneously. In the avoidant, the gradual, reluctant arrival of recognition, the specific gray that settles over ordinary days when something particular has been removed, the unfavorable comparisons that arrive uninvited when new people fail to produce what the empath produced, the specific, located quality of missing someone whose presence was genuinely particular, not replicable by general human availability. The management protocol engages. Productivity increases. The busyness that stays ahead of feeling runs at higher capacity. The narrative that was built to make the leaving feel like wisdom encounters memory, and finds memory less cooperative than it needs to be. In the empath, the gradual, also reluctant arrival of something quieter, not revelation, the slow, ordinary, one day at a time reconnection with their own interior, the tentative rediscovery of what genuinely engages them when the engagement is not organized around the dynamic. The beginning, imperfect, nonlinear, not accompanied by any particular feeling of progress, of actually being in their own life. Both processes are real. Neither is visible to the other. Both are happening in the private, unwitnessed interior of two people who are no longer in contact. What the avoidant discovers. The avoidance system, running its standard post-distance protocol, expects the following sequence. Relief arrives. Feelings diminish. Specific person recedes into manageable vagueness. Baseline restores. This sequence has worked before, has worked reliably across previous instances of created distance. The system has evidence for its prediction. The empath disrupts the prediction. Because what was particular about the empath, the specific, non-ordinary combination of deep perception, genuine selfhood, warmth without demand, presence without engulfment, does not respond to the standard diminishment process, does not become vague, does not recede into the manageable residue of someone who was once significant and is now simply historical, stays specific, stays located, stays stubbornly, inconveniently, refuses to be processed, particular. And the avoidant, whose system expected the standard sequence and is not receiving it, discovers something it did not anticipate, that the self-sufficiency it has always relied on as sufficient is not, in the specific absence of this specific person, sufficient. Not a collapse of the self-sufficiency entirely. A discovered limit. The specific place where the managed, self-contained, minimally dependent life that the system has always endorsed simply does not produce what the empath's presence produced. The accompanied feeling. The specific quality of being with someone whose presence does not cost the avoidant their autonomy. The particular relief of closeness that did not feel like a trap. In the absence of that, the self-sufficiency is still present, is still functioning, is just quieter than it used to be. The room it occupies has less in it than it had before. What the empath discovers. The empath's discovery is less dramatic and more sustaining. In the silence, in the specific, unscheduled, nobody is watching hours that were previously occupied by the navigation of the dynamic, something gradually becomes available. Access to themselves. Not a sudden revelation of their true nature or a dramatic recovery of lost selfhood. The quiet, incremental, day-by-day experience of attending to their own interior with the same quality of genuine curiosity they have historically brought to other people's. They discover things about themselves that the dynamic had obscured. What actually engages them when the engagement is not organized around managing someone else's capacity? What they actually want when the wanting is not filtered through the question of what is compatible with the avoidance limitations. Who they actually are when they are not primarily the person who understands the avoidant. These discoveries are not always comfortable. Some of what the empath finds in their own interior when they finally look honestly is things that need attending to. Patterns of their own that the avoidant dynamic was not the origin of, but was certainly compatible with. Places where the empath's own wound was operating alongside the avoidance, producing the specific chemistry that made the dynamic so compelling and so costly simultaneously. Finding these things is not failure. It is the honest work of someone who is turning their quality of attention inward, who is giving themselves what they have historically given to others: patient, accurate, non-judgmental seeing. When the reach comes, at some point, in many cases, the avoidance recognition becomes loud enough to produce action. The reach comes. In whatever form the reach takes, the message that has no practical reason, the contact that arrives after extended absence, the oblique communication that carries more weight than its surface suggests, and the empath receives it from wherever they actually are. If the silence was genuine, if the work was real, if the building was honest, if the empath was actually somewhere in their own life rather than waiting in a different configuration, the reach is received from a genuinely different place than it would have been before the silence. Not from depletion, from whatever has been built. Not from the old orientation that reorganized around the avoidant immediately upon contact. From the orientation that developed during the silence. Toward the empath's own life, their own becoming, their own genuine forward motion. This reception, warm perhaps, honest certainly, not organized around the avoidance return as the primary event, is the most honest thing available. And it communicates, without performing anything, the genuine truth of where the empath is. Somewhere, actually somewhere, with their own direction and their own momentum and their own life that is genuinely in motion. That somewhere is both the most impactful thing the avoidant can encounter and, more importantly, the most valuable thing the empath has built. What happens if the reach never comes? The avoidant may not reach. The management protocol may hold. The gray may be something lived with rather than something acted on. The recognition may arrive and be contained. If this happens, the empath who was genuinely building in the silence is not left in the failure condition. They are left with what they built. The reconnection to their own interior. The genuine investment in relationships that are actually reciprocal. The work that has real momentum. The discoveries about themselves that the dynamic had been obscuring. The specific, sustaining quality of a life that is actually inhabited rather than held in suspension pending resolution. They are left with their own life, which was never the consolation prize, was always the point. The honest summary. When both go silent, two entirely different things are happening. The avoidance silence is the system achieving its preferred condition and discovering, in the achieving, that the preferred condition is not as sufficient as it appeared. The empath silence is the limit of sustainable generosity meeting the first genuine opportunity in a significant period to attend honestly to their own interior. The avoidant moves toward recognition of what was lost. The empath moves, ideally, genuinely, without performance, toward themselves. What happens next is determined not by who contacts whom first, or what the silence produces in the other person. It is determined by what each person does with the hours that belong entirely to them. The avoidance hours are theirs, their interior work, their choice. The empath's hours are theirs, the genuine use of the silence, the honest investment, the daily, ordinary, unglamorous decision to actually be in their own life. That decision is the whole thing, not the strategy, not the impact on the other person. Simply, are you actually in your own life? Right now, today. That is the question. And it is the only one worth answering. The silence from both sides has been mapped. What each person experiences, how the processes diverge, what the reach means when it comes, and what it means when it doesn't. What remains worth adding is something more grounded. Less about the dynamic between the two people, and more about what the empath's specific experience in this silence actually consists of day to day. Not as psychology, as the honest, concrete texture of what rebuilding actually looks like when the dynamic has been the primary weather for a long time. The first weeks are not what people expect. The first weeks of genuine mutual silence are frequently described, in retrospect, as harder than the relationship itself. This surprises people. The expectation is that distance from something painful produces relief. And relief does come, but it arrives unevenly, in waves, mixed with something that is less comfortable than relief. Restlessness. The specific, low-grade, difficult-to-locate restlessness of someone whose primary occupation has been removed. The dynamic, whatever it cost, was engaging. It required constant navigation, constant reading of signals, constant calibration of expression and response. It was demanding in the way that demanding things are always demanding. It took up space, filled hours, gave the mind something to work on. In the silence, that work stops. And the hours that were filled with it are suddenly, simply, available. Available sounds good. In practice, it often feels less like spaciousness and more like exposure. Like standing in a room that has been emptied of furniture and discovering that the room is larger than you thought, and you are not sure what to do with the size of it. The empath in the first weeks of genuine silence is often not peaceful, is often restless and somewhat lost in checking the phone in the old reflexive way before catching themselves, is often finding that the thoughts drift toward the avoidant not because the love is so overwhelming, but because the habit of orientation is so established that it runs without being chosen. This is not failure. This is honest description of what the early silence actually feels like. The habit of orientation. The habit of orientation toward the avoidant, the background, often unconscious, constantly running positioning of attention toward the question of what they are doing, feeling, thinking, whether they will reach, is worth understanding as what it actually is. A habit, not a feeling, not love, not evidence of attachment that cannot be released. A habit, formed through repetition, installed through the specific, intermittent reinforcement of the dynamic, strengthened by every cycle of distance and return that trained the empath's nervous system to stay alert to the avoidance movements as a survival strategy within the relationship. Habits do not dissolve through decision. They dissolve through replacement. Through the gradual, repetitive, requires time process of a different habit becoming more established than the old one. The different habit is the orientation toward your own interior, toward your own life, toward the question of what you are actually experiencing right now, rather than what the avoidant is experiencing somewhere else. This replacement does not happen in the first weeks, often not in the first months. It happens in the accumulation of small moments where the old habit fires and the new one is chosen instead, where the attention drifts toward the avoidant and is returned without drama to what is actually present. That returning, practiced enough times, over enough days, is what gradually changes the default, what the empath is actually rebuilding. The word rebuilding implies that what existed before the dynamic was intact and simply needs to be restored. That is not quite accurate, because the empath who entered the dynamic was not without their own patterns, their own wounds, their own places where the attachment architecture was operating in ways that made the avoidant dynamic feel familiar rather than foreign. The anxious avoidant dynamic does not form randomly. It forms through a specific recognition. The empath's nervous system and the avoidance nervous system, finding in each other the precise configuration that activates the oldest, most established patterns in both. For the empath, those patterns often include the deep-seated belief that love must be earned through service to another person's emotional life, the specific comfort of being needed, even when being needed is costly, the familiar texture of uncertainty that was present in earlier attachment relationships and has been unconsciously sought ever since because it registers as the feeling of love, even when it is the feeling of anxiety. The rebuilding is not restoration of a previous state. It is the more demanding work of examining what was there before the dynamic and recognizing that some of it was already the setup for exactly this. That examination is uncomfortable, requires the specific, non-defensive honesty of someone who is willing to look at their own patterns without immediately converting the looking into self-blame. The empath who can do this, who can hold both the truth that the avoidance behavior was genuinely insufficient and the truth that something in the empath was configured to keep reaching into insufficiency. That empath is doing the deepest and most genuinely useful work available. Not because it explains or excuses what the avoidant did. It doesn't. But because understanding the empath's own side of the pattern is the only thing that prevents the same pattern from forming with someone else who happens to produce the same familiar texture. The relationships that were waiting. There are people in the empath's life who have been present throughout the dynamic, who watched, with varying degrees of directness, the investment of extraordinary empathic capacity into someone whose capacity to receive it was limited, who were themselves receiving maintenance-level presence from the empath while the full quality of attention went elsewhere. These people are still there, in the silence, in the genuine, building silence rather than the waiting silence. They become available to receive what the empath is capable of giving. The full quality, not the remainder after the primary allocation. This is where some of the most significant and least dramatic healing available actually occurs. Not in the examination of the avoidance psychology, not in the insight about attachment patterns. In the ordinary, repeated, gradually deepening experience of investing genuinely in people who are genuinely available, who call when they say they will, who remember what was said in the last conversation, who bring their own genuine presence to the relationship rather than a managed version of it, who do not require the empath to calibrate their expression to avoid triggering withdrawal. Being with these people, actually with them, with the full quality of attention that was historically going elsewhere, produces something that accumulates over time into something significant. The experience of being genuinely accompanied by people who are genuinely present. That experience, repeated enough, begins to recalibrate what the empath's nervous system recognizes as the feeling of love, begins to make the consistent, available, does not require decoding presence feel like intimacy, rather than like the absence of the charge that the avoidant dynamic produced. This recalibration takes time. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like breakthrough. It feels like Wednesday afternoon with a friend who is simply there and simply real. And over time, Wednesday afternoon with someone who is simply real begins to feel like enough, like more than enough, like the kind of accompaniment that was always actually what was needed, even when the charged, uncertain, requires sophisticated navigation dynamic felt more like love. The work that begins to matter again. At some point in the genuine silence, not on a predictable timeline, not as the result of a decision, something shifts in the relationship to work. Work here means whatever the empath cares about making or building or learning or contributing. The creative work, the professional work, the intellectual work, the physical work of maintaining a body that is actually inhabited. During the dynamic, this work was present but running at reduced engagement. The primary energy was elsewhere. The work happened but was not quite fully met. In the genuine silence, with the primary energy no longer allocated to the navigation of the dynamic, the work becomes available for fuller investment. This happens gradually. The first weeks may not show it. The restlessness and the habit of orientation toward the avoidant compete with the availability for genuine engagement. But at some point, something genuinely interesting appears. A problem worth solving, a question worth sitting with, a thing worth making that did not exist before and will exist because of specific effort applied with specific care. The engagement with that thing, the absorption in it, the genuine investment of real attention and real energy is the beginning of the quality of presence that was described in earlier conversations. The unmonitored quality, the genuine self-direction, the being actually somewhere that constitutes the deepest form of moving forward. Not because it will produce a particular effect on the avoidant, but because it is the honest experience of someone who is actually alive in their own life. What both people are left with. Months into the mutual silence, two people are living genuinely separate lives. Whatever recognition has or has not arrived in the avoidant, whatever building has or has not occurred in the empath, what the avoidant is left with depends on choices they have made with what the silence revealed. Whether the gray was faced honestly or managed back down. Whether the recognition of what was lost produced genuine work on the pattern or produced a more sophisticated version of the same avoidance. What the empath is left with depends on choices they have made. With the hours, the silence returned to them. Whether the silence was genuinely used or spent in a different configuration of waiting. If the empath used the silence genuinely, rebuilt the habit of self-orientation, invested in relationships that are actually reciprocal, engaged honestly with their own patterns, allowed work to matter again. They are left with something that belongs entirely to them, a life, actually theirs, with direction that was generated from their own genuine wants, rather than from the shape of what the dynamic allowed, with relationships that are nourishing rather than costly, with a version of themselves that is more integrated, more honest, more genuinely self-possessed than the version that entered the dynamic. That is not consolation. That is the thing itself. The life that was always available, that the dynamic was drawing on rather than contributing to, that has been waiting with genuine patience for the attention and investment that it deserved all along. It is not waiting anymore. It is being built, one ordinary day at a time, by someone who is actually there, completely,